Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride, and apologies for the slightly late start to the show today, where we had another wee gremlin attack in the system today. But I am joined today by two excellent guests. Firstly, by the SNP Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer and MP for Glasgow Central, Alison Thewliss. Alison, how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Excellent. And on the other side of me, we have a Professor in Social Policy at Stirling University and a founder member of the Women's Equality Party, Kirstein Rummery. Kirstein, how are you doing?
I'm grand, thank you.
Excellent. Well, we start today, as we always do, with just a quick coronavirus statistics update. So this is as of 2 p.m. yesterday. Today's figures obviously won't be published until a bit later this afternoon. But there were 21 new confirmed cases of COVID-19, and again, another day with 0 new reported deaths. A total of 318,361 people in Scotland have been tested. Of these, 299,939 were confirmed negative, and 18,422 tests were positive. There were 305 people in hospital last night, 3 of whom were in intensive care, with another 5 in intensive care with suspected COVID-19. And the total number who have died having received a positive test for the virus now stands still at 2,491. So just quickly, Alison, how are you feeling about how the virus is being managed in Scotland right now?
It's obviously pretty encouraging that the numbers are going generally in a good direction, that the number of people dying has been very low for the past week, and we can only hope that has been as a result of the measures to suppress the virus.
Yeah.
There are more risks now with more places opening up, more restaurants and cafes and things like that, so just to continue to encourage people to follow all the measures they can to try and stay safe, and to wash their hands and to wear face masks and all those kinds of things.
Absolutely, yeah. And Kirstein, how are you feeling about how these numbers look now?
Like Alison, I agree, it's really encouraging, but I'm a little bit cautious. I'm in one of the groups that has to shield, so we're kind of 3 or 4 steps behind how much we're allowed out. And how much we're allowed out is highly contingent on how everybody behaves when they are allowed out. I do know that I've got some really encouraging feedback from people who are going into shops and saying that, people are wearing masks. There's almost 100% compliance with that and with social distancing. But for people like me who are not going to be able to get back to work, we're not going to be able to get back to any kind of real integration into society until the virus is either really, really gone or under a lot of control, or there's a vaccine, and none of that we know when will happen. I know that the impact on particularly disabled families and carers is likely to continue to be serious unless we can really get on top of this, and that is relying on everyone else rather than on us.
Yeah, absolutely. It has been gratifying, though, as you say, to see so many people taking on the masks without really any great kind of struggle. That seems to be something that people have taken on quite willingly. So with a bit of luck, as we say, the deaths have been very low. This wee bump in cases this weekend does make us a wee bit nervous, but fingers crossed we can get through this. But we start today. Oh, sorry, just before we do start today, if you want to join the conversation, you can do so. If you're following us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, join the conversation using the hashtag Full Scottish. We will be flashing some of those tweets up on the screen throughout the show. But we start looking at Westminster, and there's been a whole lot of things happening in Westminster this week. And the first one I wanted to talk about was the release of the Russia report. Now, this was supposed to be released before the election last year. It was delayed, and there was a strong suggestion that Boris Johnson didn't want something that might be compromising to him coming out right before the election. But now Dominic Raab has said that the Russian groups sought to interfere in the 2019 general election through the online amplification of illicitly acquired and leaked government documents. So it does seem that this report on Russian interference in British democracy does contain some fairly damning findings. Alison, if I could come to you first, What's been your take on this from within the Westminster bubble? Why is it that the Tories are so resistant to releasing this report?
Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see what is in the report when it comes out next week. But it does make you suspicious, and it does raise questions when a report seems to have been suppressed for quite as long as this one has. And when you've had the former chair, Dominic Grieve, also coming out and saying that this report should be released and that this committee has also been delayed in being formed for such a long time, it's very concerning. And I hope very much that the release of the report will give us some clarity on these issues. But I'm sure that there will be much more to come out in the week to come.
Yeah. And Kirstein, how concerned are you about the idea of Russia somehow interfering in our election processes? Do you think this supposed online misinformation, how big an impact do you think that has on the public?
It's really, really difficult to say. We do know that people have been swayed over things like the Brexit referendum and the general election through online manipulation of data. We also know that Russians are not the only ones using the data in this way, but the concern, of course, is that it's a foreign party rather than a UK party. I'd be very, very surprised if they haven't. But at the same time, like Alison, I need to see what's actually been said. It's the interesting thing from an outside observer is all of the politics that goes on around this, particularly around the machinations to the election of the Security Committee, because knowing, obviously the people who have read it know what's in that, and they are the people who have been complicit in delaying it and making sure that it doesn't come out. If then what comes out is kind of disappointing or revealing, either way, it reveals much more about, I think, the status of the people involved in those machinations than it does perhaps about Russian involvement.
Mm. Now, Kirstein, you raise an issue there about the committee, and the Intelligence and Security Committee hasn't sat for some time. It finally did elect a new chair this week, but the chair was not the one that was wanted by the UK government. Julian Lewis nominated himself, was voted for by the opposition members of the committee, and then had the whip withdrawn. Alison, this idea of the British government trying to control the committees that are supposed to scrutinise the work of the government, how big a concern is this for the way democracy functions in Britain?
This is a really big issue, and the government interference in the picking of a chair of a very important security committee, or attempting to pick the chair, is really quite a worry. And you almost have to feel a little bit sorry for Chris Grayling. This is the guy, of course, who managed to put out tenders to a ferry company that had no ferries, and can't even get himself elected in a rigged election. So it is a bit of a wee shame for him, I suppose, but it is, in a more serious sense, very, very worrying that the government's tried to interfere with this, tried to put their own pick of the chair of this committee when it should be a politically neutral committee. And the way that select committees do work at Westminster, they do act as a committee, they don't act as a separate wing of government. And their chair is supposed to be, and their members are supposed to put aside those political differences and work as a team, work as a committee. So if you've got the government trying to pick the chair rather than the committee picking their own chair, that is seriously worrying. And the reaction of stripping the government whip from Julian Lewis as a means of punishing him for having done that also sets a very bad precedent. Mm.
And Kirstein, this is not the only committee chair the government has tried to influence. They got Bernard Jenkin squeezed into the chair of the liaison committee in breach of a number of conventions about how these things are done. How concerned are you about the way the Tories are kind of reshaping democracy at Westminster?
I think it is really, really difficult, particularly now that they have quite a strong majority, in that supposedly, as Alison said, these committees are meant to be relatively independent and non-partisan in the way that they work. I think the fact that Chris Grayling was either unaware of the coup against him or couldn't make it go away indicates that he was probably not the most sensible option to chair an intelligence committee. But it does raise a wider question about the shift in power. I mean, you do expect governments with a majority to try and influence as much as they can to get their own agenda forward. That's absolutely the nature of politics. But there's not just the interference into select committees, but also the interference into the way in which the civil service works actually is what concerns me a lot more. Because the civil service, the way our constitution is set up, is meant to be completely politically neutral and apart from government. These are not meant to be government-led appointments. They're meant to be absolutely neutral. And that is actually of greater concern, because that really flows, sort of limits the flow of the type of information that is given to policymakers, the type of people that they get to hear. I think MPs themselves are pretty robust and can sort of stand up to machinations, otherwise they wouldn't be there. But this idea that you undermine the civil service is actually of a greater concern to me.
Yeah. I mean, that is a subject we've talked about at some length. But in other news at Westminster this week, Boris Johnson has reportedly nominated a whole lot of new peers, people who will get to make laws and vote on laws for the rest of their lives without ever having been elected. And one of those most kind of notably was Ian Botham, the cricketer, who has no legislative experience, believes that England is an island, and has been given this peerage reportedly as a reward for his loyalty over Brexit. I mean, we've talked plenty of times, Alison, about the undemocratic nature of the House of Lords. It's the largest legislature in the world outside the Chinese Communist Party. It's the only one apart from the Iranian parliament that has clerics as a part of it. But now we see it being filled up even more with people purely based on their public support for Brexit. It's got nothing to do with any, it's not that Ian Botham is being rewarded for services to cricket. He's being rewarded for services to Brexit. How concerned are you about the state of the House of Lords right now?
Well, myself and my colleagues, we've been continually raising our concerns about the House of Lords and about the way that it operates and the way that it is just a home for cronies and donors. And this really does illustrate how ridiculous this is. This is rewarding people for their loyalty to Brexit rather than any ability, as you say, to legislate, which is the primary purpose. And actually, the Lords, as much as I would like to abolish them, have been the only real legislative check on this government of late. They're the ones that have been asking questions and putting amendments to legislation as it's been going through. So if somebody is taking this job seriously, they're there to legislate, they're there to go through, line by line on different items of bills that are passing through the House. I would question whether or not the expertise that Ian Botham brings to that role, or indeed many of the other people that have been put into the House of Lords just for their political loyalty rather than for their abilities. Because one of the great arguments that the people that are fond of the Lords try to make is they try to say, oh, well, it's all these people from their expertise in the outside world that they're bringing to the House of Lords. Well, this blows a complete hole in that argument.
Yeah. And Kirstein, I mean, it's not just, as we know, it's not just about bringing in expertise from the outside world, the likes of Digby Jones as the great business mind that he allegedly is. It is very much a house full of political patronage. What's your view on the Lords, and even as Alison says, even allowing for the fact that it's been this one check on the government?
The second chamber has got to be there to scrutinise legislation coming from the elected chamber. If that chamber then is just simply a mirror in political parties to the legislative chamber, then it doesn't fulfil its role. It's got to be different in some way. And we've got this wonderful weird mix of inherited privilege, 600-year-old ways of doing things that are really not fit for purpose. I would say that this idea that Ian Botham is there for Brexit is not new. I remember post 2014 independence referendum, a lot of new Labour peers appearing suddenly because of their support for the Better Together campaign. So this idea that, political nominees from across the board, not just from political parties, but from outside political parties, is not new. I can tell you my lovely Ian Botham story, which is the only time I ever met him was in Manchester in when he was trying to get a cheque cashed just outside Old Trafford. And he was shouting at the woman behind the desk, "Don't you know who I am?" And anybody who does that is not fit to govern, in my view. That tells us a lot about the person himself. But I would come back to this. There are a lot of some really, really good, committed campaigners. Lady Campbell, Tanny Thompson-Gray, etc. have done some absolutely fantastic work in the Lords, in the area that I do work in, around disability rights and things like that. And certainly when in the previous government, when we saw some of the machinations around Brexit and trying to lead us towards a no-deal Brexit and all sorts of things, it was the Lords that put the brakes on all of those kinds of things. So in and of itself, it doesn't function worse or better than any other unelected second chamber. I think the real problem with it is that the chamber itself is not constituted to be fit for purpose. And of course, reevaluating that and reforming that is a massive, massive task, and is probably not going to happen, certainly not in my lifetime.
Yeah. Now, of course, the other big news out of Westminster this week was the announcement of the UK government's internal market proposals, which have been described as a power surge by Michael Gove to the devolved parliaments, but as a power grab by the devolved governments themselves. Alison, coming to you first. What's the mood been amongst the Westminster group when this announcement came out?
Well, first of all, they seem to have snuck this out in a very underhand way, as they often do with things that are controversial. So as you'll have seen, Ian Blackford only heard about it very late in the day. The Scottish Government only heard about this very late in the day as well, as Michael Russell was saying on television this morning. So it is pretty underhand, and it makes you think that yes, there is something going on just by the very way in which they've approached this. But it is also the way in which the Scottish Tories are sort of in flat out denial mode, that there's nothing wrong here, that it's not a power grab. Their denial speaks volumes, I would say, because this clearly is undermining the rights of the devolved institutions, the rights of us to say, well, what kind of food safety standards do we want? What kind of things do we want to happen after Brexit? And we are very concerned about the undermining of those protections, very concerned indeed. And there's been a lot said about chlorinated chicken, but there's also the kind of the wider implications of lowering those food standards of those imports, that Scotland can't say no to things coming in, and they will be forced to take those. I would also say that the notion of Gove and others saying that a power surge is a good thing, nobody thinks a power surge is a good thing. It gubs all your electrical equipment and causes a lot of damage. So I think they need to think a wee bit more carefully about their words here, unless they actually do mean what they say by a power surge, that it will be damaging and will be expensive to fix.
Kirstein, this kind of way of doing things, setting aside the specifics of the internal market proposals, this way of doing things, of sneaking things out, of not consulting devolved governments, it seems to be becoming quite a habit for the Tories. Now, for the Party of the Union, what do you think this says about them, that they seem to just be determined to thumb their nose at devolved governments?
The Tories have had a very, very mixed relationship with the Scottish Parliament, with all the devolved administrations, but particularly with the Scottish Government as the one with the most power since 1999. And it's really, really strange when you look at the way in which Scottish Tory MSPs work within the Scottish Parliament. They're quite happy to have bits of power and to legislate on it, until they're reminded that they're supposed to step in line with the unionist idea that actually power needs to be more centralised to Westminster. I think there's also a lot of cultural, as well as political with a small p, things going on, in that most of the Tory party at the moment in Westminster either don't know or don't understand the nature of devolution and don't particularly care, because the only time it's ever come up has been as a break to what they actually want to achieve. So I think they may have had an idea that they wanted to bring all the devolved governments along with them, but particularly Brexit showed that that wasn't going to happen. So what they've done instead is treat some of the devolved governments as if they're inconsequential. And to be perfectly honest, that in conjunction with the stark difference in competence in dealing with things like COVID-19 between the Scottish Government and Westminster Government, I sometimes wonder whether they're actually being paid secretly by the independence movement, because every time they do things like that, they strengthen the case for independence, and particularly, I mean, Scots who are not pro-independence are very pro-devolution, are very pro this kind of power being held at the Scottish level. And particularly when we did some research around, in the last independence referendum, why people voted no, what they wanted was further devolution. They wanted devolution of practically everything except foreign policy. And the fact that devolution appears to be being stepped back on the back, sort of behind the scenes, etc. But those people that are following those kinds of things is much more likely to tip people who are saying, "Oh, I don't know about devolution and independence," towards the independence camp, because it's like, well, if all of our powers are going to be undermined like this, and we can see demonstrably the Scottish Government doing cooperative governance in a different and more effective way, why would we not then go the full step?
Mm. And Alison, on that note, the kind of support for this, what's your feeling about how the Scottish people will react to this? Do you think this is going to cause uproar, or do you think people are kind of just going to say, well, that's just how things work?
I think we'll have to wait on seeing that, because there's lots of other things going on. There's coronavirus and other things dominating the news at the moment. But certainly my inbox is very busy with people who care a great deal about food standards, care a great deal about the rights of the Scottish Parliament and about devolution. So I think there will be a kind of growing realisation that this is coming, and we need to find a way of getting as many people aware of this as possible, because lots of people are concerned about the notion of food standards and protecting what we have at the moment, and anything that goes to undermine devolution, people will be very wary of.
And also, Alistair Jack told the BBC this morning that any changes to food regulations specifically, I mean, obviously this internal market proposal affects a whole range of issues, but he said that, for example, with food standards, there would be legislative consent required from the devolved parliaments if something was to be changed. Do you believe him, first of all, and do you think that the UK government will respect that, given that they have been so kind of tried to run roughshod over legislative consent in the recent past?
Yeah, I mean, their practice so far would show that, yes, they're prepared to override legislative consent, they're prepared to ignore the wishes of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. And I should say that Wales are also very concerned about the implications of this too, so it's not as if it's just us complaining, it's a wider concern about what this actually means for devolution. And I think Alistair Jack can say what he likes, I suppose, on TV just now, but what will really come to the crunch will be what happens when there are these trade deals. There's not really mechanisms in Westminster just now for scrutinising trade deals, because the UK Parliament has not had to do that for quite some time. So when these trade deals come, what break will there be on asking to bring in foodstuffs that we aren't interested in having here? We don't know. So that legislation that's being talked about just now sits in the context of those trade deals and what will happen further down the line. And until we actually see the legislation and have that passed, even then, that might not be a protection against what might come in a trade deal in the future.
Well, I'm sure we will keep a very close eye on this story as it develops, and I'm hopefully we'll have you back to talk about it some more, Alison. But we move on now to some statistics that were published this week, showing that more than 900,000 children have lost access to vital financial support since April 2017, and 900 women have been forced to disclose that their third child was conceived as a result of rape in order to access tax credits and other support. This is something that, Alison, I know you were one of the first people to highlight this rape clause. How do you feel when you hear that 900 women have been put in this position? Alison? Oh, we seem to have lost Alison. Oh no, we've got you. Sorry.
We're back.
We've got you now, yeah,
Thank
sorry.
you. Yeah, just that it absolutely chills me to the bone that 900 women have had to fill in this form to say that their third child has been born as the result of rape. That they have had to put that on record and prove that to officialdom in order to put food on the table. And I should say as well as having to fill in that form, a part of the condition of that is that they're not living with the parent of that child as well, which again can put women in a very difficult position if they are forced to then leave a household where they're experiencing domestic abuse, coercive control, because at that point of leaving can be amongst the most dangerous situations for women who are experiencing this, and their children as well. So that the government knowingly puts women through this, that there are now 900 women across the UK that have filled in this form, it is really worrying, it's really disturbing. And it hasn't got any less disturbing for me over the course of this. And what coronavirus has really exposed is the weaknesses in the welfare state. There are now tens of thousands more people claiming universal credit than would ever have claimed it before. And the system is not set up to support people in the way that they ought to be supported. It's no longer a welfare net, a social security safety net. It's absolutely full of holes, and people are not being supported as a result of policies like the two-child limit.
And Kirstein, as a member of the Women's Equality Party, obviously women's rights are right at the top of your agenda. Why do you think this has been pushed through and put into practice, even when it clearly traumatizes these 900 or however many more women have had to, at least make a decision about what they were going to disclose? Why do you think the government is so deaf to the needs of women?
The rape clause is a classic example of why the Women's Equality Party was founded and why I joined it, because it's an example of a policy that was made. It was linked to policies on tax credits and universal credit, which in themselves were deeply ideologically flawed. And the two-child limit was deeply ideologically flawed. And then somebody somewhere in a committee went, oh no, but what if the third child is as a result of rape? God knows how that got on the agenda. But instead of saying, this policy is inherently anti-women and anti-children, and is deeply ideologically flawed, they went, well, what can we do to tinker with it? Because we are actually committed to the policy. We are committed to the ideology behind the policy that says the state will not support you. And as Alison said, COVID-19 has absolutely revealed the fundamental lack of support, the systematic support that is available and suitable for people in times of crisis. And so they had gone down, and in political science we call this path dependency. You've gone so far down the route of this policy that you can't backtrack and say, oh no, we were wrong. So they end up tinkering with it and making the whole thing worse than it was in the beginning. And the reason that happens is because we don't have a feminist ideology, an ideology that says let's look at how policies impact on women and families as the core of our policy making. We just simply do not have that in any system of legislation in this country, in any political party in this country. And this is exactly why the Women's Equality Party was founded, because this is how policy gets made. It gets made on an ideological basis that deeply harms women, and then when that is revealed, there is no sensible heads around the table that says this is wrong. They just carry on with deeply, deeply aggressive, harmful policies. I mean, universal credit in and of itself is a deeply harmful policy. We are seeing the way in which it absolutely is not suitable for lone parents, it's not suitable for people with disabilities, it's not suitable for all of the families that are struggling the most under COVID-19. We're not all in this together. This is hitting families in poverty, this is hitting women, this is hitting children particularly hard, particularly children in poverty. You know, you talked about the huge rise of children in poverty since 2017, the huge rise in children who would have to, you know, who are not actually gaining access to basic food. Use of food banks, the rise in numbers of children claiming free school meals, the rise in numbers of children going hungry because they can't get access to those free school meals while the schools are in lockdown. This is absolutely horrifying that this is happening in a wealthy nation. And so just to come back to your original question, which is how has this happened? This has happened because we do not have the right values and principles at the heart of our government.
So how, I mean, this is a very big question, obviously, but if you can narrow it down a wee bit, how would you change how these systems work? Is it just a matter of changing the personnel? Would a Women's Equality Party government be enough to change how these things are done?
Well, I think the Women's Equality Party wouldn't ever get into government under the present legislative system, certainly in the UK. They could gain seats in the Scottish Parliament. In fact, that's one of their aims. And their aim is to be a thorn in the side of government rather than government. And I do think this also shows the huge gap between, and that's one of the reasons why I personally went over from saying we need more devolution to actually need independence in Scotland, is because the governance system in the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government is designed to work by collaborative policy making. The electoral system is set up so it's very, very different to gain an electoral majority, although the SNP have managed it for very good reasons recently, certainly given the paucity of the opposition. But also, a lot of the research that I do around collaborative governance and policy making about the way in which the third sector is involved and the way in which civic society is involved in policy making in the Scottish Government means that you don't get policies that are badly thought through. So if you look at the example of the things that have been devolved since 2014 around welfare benefits, etc., those are working on panels of users who have got direct lived experience of the issue that is being discussed. And some of the legislation is going a little bit slower, but that's because massive great things like COVID-19 and Brexit have derailed it. But given the kind of normal policymaking terrain, the Scottish Government is set up to make better policy because it makes it in collaboration. The Westminster Government, with first past the post system and very, very tribal party politics, set up for a two-party system, is now trying to work with a 3-4 party system, which simply doesn't work. Doesn't work for that. So the Women's Equality Party are only ever going to take votes and hope that the other parties steal their policies in England, etc. But I think in Scotland they would stand a chance to actually be part of, like other small parties, to actually be part of the policy-making machinery and call to governance and just say, you know, on what basis are you making these decisions? On what basis are we thinking about the future of our economy? Have we incorporated things like unpaid work and care into our economy? Have we looked at things like investment in childcare, investment in social care that we know would actually give economic returns on the scale of roughly £1 invested, see £5 back? But because it's not seen as the mainstream kind of male economy, that doesn't get as much attention. And until parties like the Women's Equality Party start making a fuss about it and start being listened to, it won't happen. But when it does happen, I think the outcomes would be a wealthier, fairer country altogether. And I'm really sorry, because that tends to be slightly bit of a Women's Equality Party political broadcast, which I didn't intend it to be.
No, that's fine. That's part of what you're here for, is to represent your interests. So that's fine. But we do move on to take a slightly broader look now at inequality. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Saturday said that world powers were ignoring inequality in global institutions. Said inequality starts at the top in global institutions. Addressing inequality must start by reforming them. He referred specifically to the composition and voting rights in the UN Security Council and the boards of the Bretton Woods system, which is things like the International Monetary Fund, as places where inequality began. But he did say that the coronavirus pandemic has given us a chance to review how some of these systems work. So, Alison, what did you make of what the UN Secretary General had to say? And do you agree with him?
I do agree with him, and I'm very conscious in a lot of the things that I end up looking at in my role now. It's often the same sort of demographic of older white men who are responsible for things. And when that happens, as Kirsten's saying, you miss out the whole of the rest of the population and you don't take their needs into account, because if it's only people that look and sound like you that you're hearing from, then you miss everything else. And I think power has been far too concentrated with that group of people in those particular institutions. And I think he's right to point out how we go from there to actually taking action is the next big challenge, I suppose.
And Alison, Kirstein, he did say it's exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all, obviously not one of the big problems here, but a huge one in the States. And is again the fiction that unpaid care work is not work. Do you think this kind of leadership from the UN can have an impact on policy, or do you think some of the major world leaders like Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro are going to hear this and go, well, that's not something we need to worry about?
I think, I don't know if you can hear me because I'm getting a lot of...
Oh, no, we can. You're fine.
You can. Oh, that's fine. I think what these big global institutions like the World Bank, like the UN, etc., reflect, I don't think they cause inequality. I think they reflect the inequality that's already there. They reflect the fact that people are there in power because the systems promote those kinds of people in power. As Alison said, people who look like us, sound like us. And there needs to be a radical change in that. And I'm one of these people who is cautiously optimistic about COVID-19, because as horrible as it has been, and it continues to be, I think it has revealed that we simply cannot go on in the way that we govern ourselves, but also in the way that we cooperate or don't cooperate internationally and globally. You know, there's some clear evidence emerging that if the World Health Organization had acted quicker and faster, and if, more importantly, national governments had listened quicker and faster around COVID-19, we would see far fewer deaths. I would agree that the kind of neoliberal system of marketized health is not serving anybody well. But you say that's not the case in the UK, but we do see great inequality in the UK. And I think that has also contributed to our higher death rates compared to other countries that took much more of a state-driven focus, intervened earlier, intervened harder, intervened quicker, kind of thing. And it's really where the power lies, that these really institutions like the UN, institutions like really big pan-global, are only going to change if it's in their own interests. And until the big economic drivers see that it's actually economically, socially, and politically in their interest to tackle some of this inequality, then they're not going to move very far. And we are hampered by the fact, going back to what Alison was saying, is that it is the same powerful white men in charge who will always take decisions that benefit themselves, their class, and their approach to things. Until we get more people with different kinds of voices in those positions of power, then we're not going to see very much change within the institutions themselves. But the positive side of that is when we do get changes. So the work that, for example, Christine Lagarde has done in the World Bank, etc., around taking into account unpaid care, taking into account women's issues in the economy, does demonstrate that there is the capacity for that within institutions if they do open up to different voices.
And Alison, we've heard this idea that coronavirus has given us a pause, a break in the system. where we can stop and take stock. And we've heard lots of big ideas talked about, things like well-being economics being, has kind of come out of nowhere recently to become a big issue. Same thing with universal basic income. Do you get the sense that we are going to see these kinds of changes, or do you think there's an instinct amongst governments just to get back to business as usual as quickly as possible?
I think there's a lot of things going on here. So going back to business as usual, lots of people's jobs are tied up in business as usual. And if you say things aren't going to go back, people will be worried naturally that their own incomes, that their own circumstances will be permanently changed. So I think we need to be careful about how we do this, but it is an opportunity. It is an opportunity to do things differently, to say, what does the workplace look like? Do we need to have people commuting into our cities for the purposes of sitting in an office all day so that they can go and spend money buying their lunch? Or do we want to have them spending money more locally in their own communities and living and working there a bit differently? So I think we need to think about how that works. And obviously, as an MP with a city centre in my constituency, there are benefits and there are downsides to that. But now is the opportunity really to look at that and to see, what does work look like, what does fairness look like, and how can we use things at this moment in time to make a change.
Yeah, and Kirstein, much the same question to you. How confident are you that we will see some of these changes that a lot of people are talking about as we emerge from this pandemic?
I'm not sure about the changes to government, but the changes to work certainly have been very, very profound and will continue to be profound. And like Alison, I've got kind of slightly mixed feelings about that. In my sector, in the higher education sector, we had a week to radically change the way in which we delivered our teaching. And certainly in the final semester, we had to go from face-to-face teaching with interlocutor exams, etc., to online teaching, online assessment, all sorts of things. And for many reasons, that's actually quite a good thing. It forced us to be creative. It forced us to think about, well, what are we actually preparing our students for? We are preparing our students for a world in which these kinds of changes will happen, and they'll be doing much more things online, and they will be doing things in a different way. And the old system of us all being in a classroom together and then having an exam at the end of the semester is maybe not fit for purpose. We would never have had to think about that. We'd have carried on for 20 years doing that, even if it wasn't fit for purpose. Certainly in terms of people's access to the technology. So in some regards, it makes it much more possible for people with who are trying to cope with additional access arrangements, disabled workers, etc., to work. I've always done a lot of work from home because I've got mobility issues, etc. And now everybody's kind of like putting their tanks on my turf, and they're learning how to work how I've been working for ages. And that is actually quite annoying because they're not as good at it as I am. But the other thing, of course, is absolutely right. Why are we travelling? Why are we again, to take my own sector as an example, why do we go abroad to international conferences, which have got a huge impact on the environment, huge impact on our workload, huge impact on, not being accessible to people with childcare, people with other caring commitments, people with disabilities who might not be able to travel, when actually, if the technology, and unfortunately the fact that we started this program 50 minutes late because the technology let us down, maybe indicates we're not quite there yet. But if the technology works, it can be fantastically inclusive. It can reduce the pollution. It can, make us much more in touch with our local communities. I know my neighbours now far better than I ever would have, and that's a positive thing. Growing, resilient, caring communities is the way we're going to have to get out of this crisis, but also the way that we're going to have to work in the future. But the other thing that really, really revealed is the huge gender divide between paid and unpaid work. And just to take finally an example from my sector, men are submitting journal articles through the roof, 150%. Women's submissions of research-based journal articles have tanked, and in some journals are just not getting them from women at all. And it's not hard to understand why. It's because women have had to do the juggling of the schooling their children from home, taking on board extra caring classes, etc., and they just haven't had the capacity to do the extra work. Men, and I don't think this is all men, but men have gone to their sheds in my profession, and they've taken the opportunity to work from home and not be annoyed by colleagues or students in the office to churn out 3 more research articles. And we need to be really, really careful when coming out of this, thinking about rebalancing the economy. That we value that unpaid care work that has absolutely held our communities together and got us through this, but also that we reevaluate what we value in the workplace and how we accommodate that, how we accommodate all of the other responsibilities that we have, the parenting, the caring, etc., that we have to balance, because the parenting and the caring, as we have discovered, is just as important as the making money in terms of keeping our whole society going.
Well, when we talk about inequality, obviously race is one of the great axes of inequality, and one of the great anti-racist campaigners in the US, John Lewis, died this week. He was a Democratic member of Congress from Atlanta since 1987. 80 years old he was. John Lewis was a protege of Martin Luther King when he was the last surviving speaker from the March on Washington in 1963. He spoke first, and Martin Luther King spoke last when he made the "I Have a Dream" speech. Coming to you first, Alison. How did you feel hearing about John Lewis's death?
Tremendously sad, really. He's made an incredible impact on the world. When you look at all of the things that he has done and said and achieved in his life, he really is an incredible human being, and we're the poorer for losing him, but very much the greater for having had his experience in the world and his contribution, because he really has been a person who has made change, who has led, and who has done things that the world can be glad of long after he's gone.
Yeah, Kirstein, this is a man who was beaten, arrested multiple times during his life by both the police and by a variety of thugs. How did you feel hearing about this?
Well, I mean, he stands up there for me with Nelson Mandela as somebody who made the transition from activism into mainstream politics, did it incredibly well, but also faced huge barriers and did it with such grace and charm, and won over opposition. He was an incredibly able politician as well as an incredibly able activist, and not that many people make that transition in the way that he did, with the significant impact that he had. And of course, he's one of the last surviving ones. He died at the age of 80, having achieved, as Alison said, a great deal. The other thing that made me really sad, though, was how far we still have to go in terms of dealing with racial inequality, not just the violent inequality that we see on the streets of police brutality, but just the endemic racism within our societies. And, you know, Scotland can't hold itself up as being a beacon of racial equality at all. We've got a hell of a lot of work to do here as well as in the US. But just in terms of as a, you know, graceful and erudite, incredibly good politician dealing with these incredibly difficult issues, he was an absolute beacon for me.
Yeah. Very sad news, obviously. And obviously we send out our best wishes to his friends and his family. But another notable leader has a big event this week as well. It is Nicola Sturgeon's birthday. Now, Broadcasting Scotland will not be clapping for Nicola, but we do want to just have a wee think about where our First Minister stands right now. Alison, she's the leader of your party. She's somebody that you've worked with closely, somebody I imagine you consider a good friend as well as a political colleague and leader. How are you feeling on the First Minister's 50th birthday?
Oh, firstly, I would wish her a happy birthday, and hopefully she has a lovely day with her family and a well-deserved day off, because she has been working incredibly hard all the way through this, and the way in which she has carried herself and been so responsible, I suppose, all the way through the coronavirus crisis has been very, very very, very inspirational to watch, really. I mean, when you look, it's really no comparison, but when you look at the way the UK government has behaved and the way that she has behaved, making sure that she's following the signs, that she's behaving in a way that gives the rest of us confidence in how we can go about our day, and gaining the trust of the population as well. And the measures that have been put forward in coronavirus have been reasonably well complied with in Scotland. And I think that's because people here have understood that it's important, whereas the mixed messages coming from Westminster have left people going, well, I'm just going to make my own mind up and do what I like. So I think she's been incredibly conscientious all the way through this. And I hope today she's having a nice day off, as I say, with her family.
Yeah. And Kirstein, Nicola Sturgeon's the first female First Minister of Scotland. She's obviously had to come into this situation with the coronavirus. This is being kind of dumped on her. How do you think she's coped through this crisis?
It's interesting looking at this, comparing her standing amongst world leaders in this, because I mean, I've got family and I do work with people in Europe, Germany, Austria, and places like that. And the press there have put her up on a pedestal alongside people like Angela Merkel, alongside the Icelandic president, alongside Jacinda Ardern, etc., even though she's not in charge of a whole country. But in terms of leaders who have absolutely stepped up when needed to. In stark contrast, as Alison says, to leaders that quite haven't stepped up. And the fact that we go out and we see everybody wearing masks in Scotland, no matter what their political persuasion, I think is a real mark of how much she is trusted as a leader and how much we really needed a leader like her in times like this. And it's that compassion and competence that is at the heart of her leadership. That is really, really put, she's come into her moment. I wish it wasn't this moment. I wish we didn't have to have COVID-19. But if we had to have a demonstration platform for someone who was an absolutely brilliant leader, then she's certainly stepped up to it. And I would like to say happy birthday. She's the same age as me, so she makes me feel like a complete underachiever in that I haven't lead a small country into, out of an absolute world health crisis. But also, I think the way in which she is actually admired politically across the board. Even people who disagree with her politically, even people who are not behind the independence idea, wouldn't vote for the SNP if you would, set them on fire if they wouldn't, kind of thing, admire her leadership. She's also directly responsible for membership of the SNP in Berlin and Vienna Rising, because both my mother and my sister have joined the SNP as a result of her leadership and didn't join the Women's Equality Party. So I don't know what that says about who did. But certainly, just to go back to that idea that, in terms of the way in which she has presented herself, the way in which she's kept her head, stayed calm, changed direction when she needed to, been humble, listened to the experts, changed the ideas. She's taken that political responsibility when the science is conflicting very, very well and in a very competent way. And she is trusted, which is all that can be said for other leaders.
Yeah, obviously we do wish Nicola Sturgeon a very happy birthday. We're absolutely certain that she's watching, as Alison said, at home, having a wonderful day with her family. What better way to spend an hour than with us here at the Full Scottish? That is just about all we have time for today. Again, we do apologise for the slight delay at the start of the show, but we think it's still been a pretty good show altogether. Thank you very much to Alison and to Kirstein for joining us, both excellent guests, and I do hope we'll have both of you back very soon. And thank you at home for joining us as well. This is the bit where we have to ask you for your help, though. If you're able to support Broadcasting Scotland financially, then please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month is what helps us make these shows possible. It's what keeps the lights on. It's what pays for the new equipment, although we may have to ask for a refund on some of it. But we can't survive without financial support. Unfortunately, money does make the world go round. So if you're able to support us, then please do. If you're not able to support us financially, we absolutely do understand. Don't worry, the shows will always be free to view online. But you can still help us out by spreading the word. You can follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. You can find us on Facebook as well. And from there, please do share the shows around. Let people know why you watch Broadcasting Scotland. Encourage them to give us a try as well. We don't have any budget at all to advertise. So if you can help us spread the word about what Broadcasting Scotland is, what we're trying to achieve here, then that's a huge, huge contribution from you as well. And finally, if you want to get involved here, if you'd like to be part of building a better broadcaster for Scotland, then there are lots and lots and lots and lots of opportunities here. We would love to hear from you if you have any interest in working in television production, whether that's in sound, camera, working in front of the camera like me, whether it's as a journalist, preparing stories, doing research, all these kind of jobs. There's lots to be done here if we're going to become the kind of broadcaster that Scotland deserves. So do please get in touch with us if you've got any interest there. But that is absolutely all we have time for today. So thank you once again to Kirstein and Alison for joining us. Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7 with Scotland at 7. I'll be back on Tuesday in my regular slot. But until then, have a lovely Sunday. Goodbye.